Hi, everyone, and welcome to our VPR event. It's nice to see you all or know that you're out there and that no one has had to drive tonight during whatever kind of storm we're having here in Vermont. I'm Angela Evansy. I'm the host and creator of Brave Little State, which is VPR's people-powered journalism show. And it's my pleasure to help kick off tonight's conversation titled Get Me Rewrite: How the News Media Must Change to Mend Our Ruptured Reality. Before we get underway, I just want to say a quick thank you to tonight's sponsors, Three Penny Tap Room in Montpelier and St. Michael's College in Colchester. And it is a pleasure and an honor to introduce tonight's speakers. We have with us Garrett Graff, who is a journalist and author and historian based here in Vermont. Garrett's most recent book is The Only Plane in the Sky. It's an oral history of 9/11. You can find it at your local bookstore. And the audiobook is narrated by a full 45-person cast. And last year was named the 2020 Audiobook of the Year by the Audio Publishers Association. And Garrett is also a member of VPR's Board of Directors. And I welcome you to turn your video on, Garrett, whenever you're ready.
Hi, thanks so much for having us tonight, Angela.
Welcome. And we're also super excited to have Brooke Gladstone here with us tonight. Brooke, of course, is the host and managing editor of the WNYC program On the Media, an excellent show. And Brooke has a comic book about the history of the media and how it works, titled The Influencing Machine. And it was just re-released as a 10th anniversary edition with an expanded afterword. It takes on social media and disinformation. You can also get it at your local bookstore. And I welcome you, Brooke, to turn on your video and say hello.
Okay, well, this is problematic, but don't worry.
All right, are you having some video issues?
Why did this happen?
No worries. While you figure that out, I'm going to go over just a few more housekeeping for this evening. So for everyone who is now seeing you, welcome. We will have Brooke and Garrett in conversation for about a half an hour to kick things off tonight. And then we'll transition to a Q&A portion of the evening. I'm going to help moderate those audience questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. And you can begin, if you have a question, you don't have to wait until that Q&A. You can begin entering your questions now in the YouTube comments section, and keep an eye on those. And like I said, get to as many as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Garrett and Brooke. Thank you again so much, and we're really looking forward to tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks, Brooke, for joining us on this snowy Vermont night. Welcome to Vermont Public Radio, and welcome to Vermont. It's a wonderful chance to get to talk with you tonight. As we've discussed, I've been able to be a guest a couple of times on the media over the years, and so it's fun to get the chance to turn the tables and ask some questions of the radio host now. And we have a great topic to discuss tonight. I mean, this question of where the media goes in February of 2021, it would be hard to find a more interesting time or moment to ask that question in the last 75 years of American media. And I think we're going to spend a little bit of time tonight trying to unpack some of the history that got us to where we are at this moment. But let me start tonight, Brooke, by asking you a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, which is, has the media just had it too good for these last 4 years? That, you're looking at the subscriber numbers coming out of the New York Times, of the Washington Post, the listener numbers for NPR, the largest that they ever have been, 7 million digital subscribers now to the New York Times, a company that now gets more than half of its revenue from its digital subscribers. CNN coming off some of its highest rated months and years of all time. And, how does the media keep going with such a tremendous, wonderful, happy time in the media landscape right now?
I guess another question would be how was the media able to keep going when the business model was completely broken and everything was going to pot? There's nothing that concentrates the mind, to paraphrase an old axiom, more than moral panic and existential angst. And I think we saw a lot of that in the last 4 years. And you're absolutely right. At least for legacy media, national media, things have gone very well. Local media, however, which are the media that most reflect what is happening where we live and can have a great deal of impact on how and what happens, then they're not doing very well. There hasn't been anything to replace that broken business model. Not even Trump could pull that off. And so if we talk about the national media, the legacy media, or just particular kinds of media, our show has never done that well. I mean, our show has grown over the last 20 years. We just had our 20th anniversary, but this was very solid for us. And I think it's because people really respond to conversation that, to a degree, reflects what they're feeling and answers the questions that they're having. So anybody who is able to pull that off, whether strictly within the confines of traditional mid-century journalism or through some other means, if people got to hear what they wanted to hear, whether or not that was your intention, then you were going to do better.
Brooke, let's back up and talk a little bit about that mid-century media moment, which I think many people in media, many people in America sort of talk about as this golden age of American journalism, and sort of this idea that there was, newspapers were wealthy, the TV stations, the TV networks were wealthy. They were able to provide foreign bureaus and domestic bureaus all around the country and all around the world. And every night, all of America sat down and listened to Walter Cronkite present all of the news that actually mattered, and do it in this wonderful, totally neutral, objective and factual manner, and then declare at the end of his newscast, and that's the way it is.
Right.
And for many Americans,
that's pretty good, Garrett.
Thank you. And for many Americans, that was the way that it was. There was no alternative to Walter Cronkite's news. But that,
of course, it wasn't how it was. Right?
Well, exactly. And that's sort of what I'd be interested in having you talk to is, what was that moment? What was that moment as wonderful as we remember it to be?
I think what's important to understand about the Cronkite moment, that mid-century moment, the moment of civility, of a common purpose, of a fairly narrow range of political views, is what led up to it. I mean, prior to a particular technology, if you go back to the beginning, the government subsidized the mail delivery of our printed media. I mean, right after our founding. Later, you had steam-driven or rotary presses that made producing papers cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You could sell them to the vast waves of immigrants becoming Americans over the course of the centuries, and especially the 19th century. And then suddenly, what you get is a technology that suddenly made media more expensive than it was before instead of less. And so the media outlets that were using it, and I'm obviously I'm talking about television. Radio was expensive and was a precursor of what was going to happen, but essentially they were using a limited resource, which was frequencies, the people who operated and owned radio and television networks. They had to get agreement with the government over what would be required in order to have access to those frequencies. Then you had this incredibly expensive medium of television, which meant that you had to have audiences far bigger than you ever had before to support it. So you have to create a consensus. Then you had something else, not just the need to work with the government, but a reason to do, the possibility of global annihilation, the atom bomb. So there was a political reason, a moral reason, and an economic reason for all of us to be on the same page. And Walter Cronkite and the like helped create that page. The extremes on both sides were marginalized. So were all the different cultures that made up America. You barely heard anyone who had an accent or a vowel at the end of their names. You didn't see Black people. You hardly saw Jews, at least in front of the camera. You didn't see anybody other than this white Anglo-Saxon America reflecting back in news through the newscasters and even through entertainment. It was Leave It to Beaver. And that was our America. And if you didn't fit in there, if you didn't see yourself there, if you didn't hear yourself there, you know, you just had to lump it. You had to find yourself there, even if it wasn't you. So it wasn't all perfect. That civility wasn't because somehow people were more civilized then. It was practical.
And we've seen this sort of steady erosion of that, reporting construct or reporting frame, what Jay Rosen calls the view from nowhere. We've seen that unravel really over the last 25 years with the rise of internet journalism, the democratization of voice online, and particularly, I would argue, really with the rise of social media and the way that you can begin to see reporters and journalists and bloggers and all sorts of people speak through social media outside of the confines of a newspaper or a television show or a radio show. And I'm curious, as someone who has, covered and studied and talked about this unraveling of the view from nowhere and the idea that journalists report entirely objectively 100% of the time. What do you make of this moment and sort of what the Trump era has taught us about what journalism needs to be?
Right. We keep learning what journalism needs to be, but it seems it needs to be whatever the moment seems to call for. And because this is not a public medium, except in rare cases like Vermont Public Radio, but one that is driven by profit, something that Walter Lippmann was tearing his hair out over in the 20s, that how are you going to have a media, anything, an organization devoted to public service when it has to generate its own profits, and ultimately when it has to bow to the whims of boards of directors. Now, the thing is that it unraveled from the mid-century. It didn't unravel from the beginning of the creation of America or for most of its history. It's this objectivity thing which isn't really possible for humans, is a product of the last century and just the middle of it. I was reminded, and I looked it up, when Adolph Oakes bought the New York Times in 1896, he wrote famously in editorial, the one that has come to stand for journalism's highest ideals, He said, "It will be my earnest aim that the New York Times give the news impartially, without fear or favor, regardless of party, sect, or interest involved, to invite intelligent discussion from all sides," and so forth. Anybody who is in journalism or knows anything about journalism knows the phrase "without fear or favor" and the word "impartially." But he went on in that editorial to talk about, he said there would be no departure from the general tone unless it be to intensify its devotion to the cause of sound money and tariff reform. In other words, it was full of opinion. It was just what some philosophers call naive empiricism, that if something comes over the transom, it doesn't have to be independently validated. You know it's true. It's the same truthiness that Colbert talked about during the George W. Bush administration, and that reached its apotheosis with Trump. So, you know, objectivity per se doesn't mean better journalism. Some of the best journalism this country's ever produced has been from people who had a cause. The great muckrakers at around the same time as Adolph Oakes was writing this famous line were investigating Standard Oil and so forth, and were doing it with an aim in mind, with a goal in mind. So the Trump era exploded something, and I think it forced the media in some sense to become more truthful because it became so defensive. But now we get to I know I've given way too long an answer for radio, but the question is, you know, what happens next? Well, we have to understand that, as one internet sage once put it, transparency is the new objectivity. If you want people to be trusting and you want people to believe you, then you need to tell them your process. You need to make your sources available when possible. You need to be able to allow them to reverse engineer your reporting to the extent you can without exposing your sources, if they don't want to be exposed. And you tell them where you're coming from, and they'll still listen if they believe you to a degree.
And we've really seen what we might call legacy media struggle, I think, with that over the last couple of years, both in terms of the partisan political realm, and then particularly, I think, over the last, let's say year, 18 months, as the country has had this racial reckoning, and legacy media, and particularly the New York Times and the Washington Post, have sort of struggled with how to welcome their whole reporters to their workplaces. We've seen
you mean reporters with opinions?
Exactly. The sort of reporters who have personalities, who have opinions, who express those opinions publicly, online, outside of the pages of their own newspaper. And do you think that helps trust in journalism, or do you think that helps? Do you think that hurts trust in journalism?
I once had a conversation with Ethan Bronner, the longtime Middle East reporter, among many other things, for the New York Times. And he says that it would be great if reporters didn't state their opinions all over the place, because once you've put a stake in the argument, once you've committed yourself, then you may find yourself committing also to defending that argument, even if it becomes less tenable. And I think psychologically, there's a great element of truth in that. Once somebody buys a car, they're going to try and convince you to buy the same car because it validates their purchase of the car. It's a kind of a human impulse to get buy-in. So for that reason, I could see reporters, if not putting a cork in it, at least going easy so they don't find themselves backed into a corner where they have to defend the position rather than describe what is happening. But that doesn't mean you eliminate all elements of judgment from your stories, all elements of experience, what you've seen and what you've heard. I mean, I think it's the role of reporters, foremost and paramount, to be fair and accurate. Don't leave out information, even if it cuts across your argument, and don't ever put something into a story that you knowingly understand to be untrue. I think that if you do that, then you're a really good journalist. You make it harder on yourself if you're seen all the time marching and so forth, unless you want to be a journalist of a certain sort, an activist, muckraking journalist. And as I said, there's a fine tradition for that. In that case, you're already dug in, so you should reveal it to your audience.
I've struggled with this in my own writing and in my own speaking over the last 4 years to try to draw a distinction. I come from a magazine tradition which always has more voice and more space for a writer and a writer's personality than a newspaper does, where I generally don't get involved in policy, but I do feel it is a journalist's right and obligation to speak up for values, and that on the one hand, freedom of the press. That in my mind, it is okay to call something that is anti-democracy, and to be blunt about that, and to say that has no place or should have no place in the American political sphere. Mm-hmm. And I think that's been something that a lot of journalists have had to struggle with over these last 4 years, the last 5 years, really, since the 2016 campaign, where it sort of seems like as a journalist that you're forced to think about whether you cover both sides of a values debate equally, and sort of present them as some people are in favor of certifying the election and some people aren't. And, there are good points on
that is not, as far as I'm concerned, that is neither fair nor accurate to present both sides equally. For a very long time, reporters were doing that over the climate debate. The one climate scientist who's paid for by hypothetically Exxon on the one hand, and the entire consensus of scientists on the other, given equal ink or equal time. That is what I would call, you should pardon the expression, cover your ass journalism, not fair and accurate journalism. This is because journalists have been in a defensive crouch since at least the Nixon administration for left-wing bias. As a result, a fairness and accuracy in media and a variety of other places have counted up how many liberal voices and how many conservative voices appear on those mainstream media programs. And always, no matter what the presidency is or the Congress is in terms of party, it is always more conservatives and more Republicans. There's never a time when there isn't, whether it is the Republican or the Democrat on trial or in power. And why is that? That is that defensive crouch. And I think that if you give equal sides to unequal arguments, you're not doing your job. But the thing you said that I really want to underscore is this issue of values. There was, with all of the deceptions coming out of the White House, all the lies spoken by the president, it became a bunch of shiny objects that reporters were just grabbing for right and left. And there needed to be a way to triage that. I mean, when Trump said very early, oh, they've run out of ball dresses for the inauguration because it's so popular in Washington, you can't buy an evening gown. You know, a Washington Post reporter went out and found out whether or not, you know, there were evening gowns. There were plenty of them. But, you know, the thing is that you have to pick your targets in a time when, and this is a cliche, when reality is under attack. You're not going to be able to hold up all parts of that collapsing building. You find that corner that with all your effort, you can maybe help keep from crumbling. And, you know, you apply your values. Those are moving targets. There were many articles from very objective papers arguing the pros and cons of slavery, you know, more than 200 years ago. There were people arguing about the internment of the Japanese, far more recently than that. You have to try and figure out what is true. Now that's fundamentally a personal decision. It can't be called objective. That's why I think it's important that that reporters no longer regard themselves as part of a fraternity of passionless priests. No one needs us for that. And it was never all that good.
So we'll turn it over to Angela and some of the audience questions here in a minute. But before we do that, a question for you, Brooke, in that looking ahead now, this is going to be a year of some immense turnover in many of the top media jobs in the nation. You know, Marty Barron retiring from as editor of the Washington Post. You know, a lot of speculation that Dean Baquet will be retiring from the New York Times. You know, Jeff Zucker leaving CNN at the end of this year as the head of CNN. What advice would you give to someone stepping into the editorship of the Washington Post or the New York Times about what the nation needs from those outlets and those newspapers and news organizations in the years ahead?
Is this a kind of a values question, or is this like a, you know, fortunately and understandably, no one has ever put me in a management position, but I can say that if you believe that your job is to interrogate the nation and start helping to reveal what needs to be revealed in order to build what was never built or what needs to be rebuilt, I think we need to focus on structural inequality and judicial inequality. And I don't think this is solely bound down to race. I mean, I did a number of years ago, I did a series on the myths around poverty, which was very eye-opening. And it certainly wasn't exclusively focused on communities of color, because that would have left out, you know, the vast number of white people, the majority of the poor in this country, because there are so many white people, the majority of them are white. But nevertheless, there are structural inequalities all across the culture, many of which do involve race. We do need to talk about how we police, and, you know, all of the way that the money has flowed since the Reagan administration. And we have to talk about how to fix our electoral system and shore up our democracy, if that in fact is still our project in the, so-called American experiment. Also, you mentioned Jay Rosen talking about the news from nowhere, from no particular position, from no set of values. He also had another phrase, the people formerly known as the audience. And I think the time has come for all reporters to understand that you can't glide along in a little bubble. I mean, we're all in bubbles now, and there's never been a more urgent time to find a way out.
That is a excellent transition, I think, to start answering some of the audience questions. And Angela, if you want to rejoin us and ask some questions away.
Yes, will do. And before we go to some of those questions, just a quick tech item for you, Brooke. Some of us are hearing a little distortion on your audio. And so we wanted to ask if you could maybe get a little closer to your mic or bring your mic closer and see if that helps.
I'm not sure if this is, does this sound louder or no? I don't think this mic is being used, or is it? Is this less distorted?
There's still a little distortion. You sound clear.
Okay, then, oh God, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. I hope it didn't sound too bad.
No, it's totally possible to understand you. And just in case folks on the YouTube end are hearing it, we wanted to just see if we could work on it a little bit, but don't worry at all. We're hearing every word, and we're
I'm going to see if switching mics, how does this sound? Does this sound better? This sounds better?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. This is, I have switched to this mic now, which is, a little intrusive, but there you go. And I'm on a different mic than I was. So
Perfect.
I'm sorry I wasn't here early enough for the tech. This is my fault.
No worries at all.
But
no worries.
Sorry, guys.
So we'll go to the first question that we got from Edie, who asks, has anyone figured out how to cover people who are purveyors of false news and conspiracy theories without rewarding the perpetrators with widespread publicity? And are there any specific ideas for regulating social media so the companies themselves don't become the new arbiters of truth?
Well, the companies already are the arbiters of truth in many fundamental ways. So the question is, what do we do about that? And yes, there are all sorts of plans, some better than others. All of them will yield unintended consequences, and that is a long discussion. In terms of just basic reporter practice when it comes to lies and liars, one linguist suggested that you do what they call a truth sandwich, sort of like Barack Obama is American, born in Hawaii. Donald Trump says he was born in Kenya and is not an American citizen, but he is an American citizen born in Hawaii. That's the truth sandwich. Because the problem is, and this has been explored in many studies, if you repeat a lie over time, people will forget what is true and what is not true, but little neural pathways will be created for the sentiment, whether true or not. I mean, I think that happened with, crooked Hillary. It just, you may have voted for Hillary, but that crooked Hillary thing is still a pathway that got carved into your brain by Donald Trump. And, there's that natural feeling we have of where there's smoke, there's fire. Even if the smoke is being produced solely by a single person or group of people, or a television or a cable news channel or a digital channel, it's all the same. It creates a smoke that fogs up the picture for everybody.
So, and I think I would add one thing on the social media side to that as well, which is, part of the challenge with talking about social media as arbiters of truth, or talking about the way that conspiracy theories spread so quickly on social media is we talk about it as if that's the system is broken, that the Facebook algorithms are somehow doing something that they're not supposed to.
They are. The people who created them say that.
Right. And they are in fact working exactly as designed, and that these ideas spread because that is what the social media algorithms are biasing and selecting for. And that the companies know this and are choosing not to do anything about it. And you saw that most clearly with Facebook around the election and the inauguration, where Facebook actually has the ability to put a quality screen on its algorithm in the news feed that bumps up the visibility of, trusted news organizations and de-emphasizes, conspiracy-laden garbage sites. And that notably, Facebook leaves as a default the quality filter off, and that it was only during the week of the election and then in the wake of January 6th, they announced that they would also turn it on for the week around the inauguration. But that, Facebook knows exactly what it is doing, and it is choosing to allow its platform to be manipulated by people who do not have the best interests of our democracy in mind. And I think that sort of one of the challenges that the Republican Party faces writ large right now is that over the last 30 years, they have given, somewhat accidentally, somewhat purposefully, control over their party's base to people who do not have governing or politics or policy in mind, but are primarily profit motivated. And that you see, people like Fox News, people like conservative talk radio, people like Dan Bongino or Ben Shapiro, for whom outrage is the business.
And those two are hugely popular on Facebook.
Exactly.
Where there are no quality controls put on there, or even indicators put there. I mean, Facebook leverages dopamine. So it's going to keep it's more profitable to keep those people on. And they're also under attack more by Republicans, or have been when the Republicans were in power, and they still are to a degree, certainly on the state and local level, over their so-called anti-conservative bias, although the very people you mentioned demonstrate very clearly that that isn't the case. And yeah, you're absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I just think about all of what's pushing against change there. It's going to have to be forced. Interestingly, in recent months, Facebook's own employees have risen up, which is very unusual for these tech companies. The history is people are true believers and they sign on as loyal soldiers to the cause. And Facebook's employees have started to peel away. I don't know if they're quitting, but they are signing lots of petitions. And it's unusual.
So we have another question about accountability in this landscape, but not about social media. So Rich asks, when Dominion Voting Systems and then Smartmatic sued broadcasters and individuals for defamation, we noticed some behavioral changes. For example, seeing Newsmax dial back on the lies around vote switching. But when lies
Goodbye, Lou Dobbs. That's another one.
But Rich continues, but when the lies in reporting hurt democracy rather than businesses, who has standing to sue? And what role, if any, should government play in policing the veracity of news reporting?
We just had an impeachment. To get government to play an active role in bolstering our democracy, we have to fix our electoral system. We have to push very, very hard. In a very few years, 70% of senators will represent 30% of the American population. It's, you know, it's the whole thing with very sparsely populated states. And hey, I love Vermont. I went to high school and college in Vermont. I have family in Vermont. But it is the way that this system is structured now will continue to create obstacles to defending democracy because people in Congress won't want to do that. That's not a project that certain people in Congress are in favor of. They would prefer a minority government. And that's part of the reason why Trump was successful, because all the polls suggest that the majority of Republican policies don't find favor with the majority of Americans. But we can all be frightened by change and by people we don't understand, and by a sense that what we had is being taken from us. These are feelings that are inspired by the Trumpism. And Trumpism can exist quite well and flourish without Trump, I think.
And I actually think, one of the things that we are watching right now is that not only is Trumpism succeeding without Donald Trump, that in many ways, Donald Trump is still the center of Trumpism. And that if you look at the history of, say, a Sarah Palin arc of a figure in politics like that, that actually the peak of Sarah Palin's power came in the 2010 midterms with the rise of the Tea Party, sort of 2 years after she had lost at the ballot box. And that was really the wave of primary candidates that she endorsed, that she helped fundraise and select in the primaries, that sort of powered her vision and ideology in the midterm elections in 2010. And I think we are very likely to see that same phenomenon play out over these next 2 years, where I think in some ways the peak of Trumpism might actually take place in 2022 in the Republican midterms, because what we have dynamic-wise right now is this fascinating, weird moment where the Republican Party as a percentage of Americans is shrinking. It is the smallest that it ever has been today in terms of the percentage of Americans who identify as Republican, but that within that crowd, Donald Trump still has, as of this week, an 85% approval rating. That sort of the party is getting smaller, but more Trumpian.
I don't know. Although Sarah Palin was helping to build the Tea Party, she was a driver. I sort of see Trump as much a result as a driver, in a sense. The 12 years, or at least 8 years of the Obama administrations rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and also the lack of change in that period. Frankly, there were plenty of voters who voted for Obama and then switched to Trump because they wanted disruption, because they didn't like the system the way it was working. Which brings me back to that values question again. Is we have to deal with the system. Trump, I don't doubt that he will be around, and maybe you're right. maybe he will find his strongest period in the next 2 years. But frankly, I don't know how you can be stronger than president. And the fact is that his popularity, durable as it may be, has definitely decreased. Of course, those things go up and down with the wind.
Well, this segues really nicely into two questions that we've gotten about Trump, and two people wondering, how should the media continue to cover the former president, right, as he seeks to continue to control the narrative and take up oxygen? Or I would tackle my own question too, like, or is it no longer a decision about covering Trump or not? Is it more about covering now Trumpism, like you've been talking about?
Well, I think we do need to cover Trumpism. I don't think, not now that he is not president, no news outlet can use the excuse that anything that a president says is, ipso facto newsworthy. That's no longer the case. So if he wants to say that Meryl Streep and Hamilton are overrated, we don't need to cover that anymore. I could argue that we never did when he said those things. And but now we certainly don't. He still has political heft. He can still throw himself behind particular candidates. There are certainly occasions when covering Trump, his moves, his lawsuits, and so forth will be very newsworthy. I don't think we can just pretend, as Nicholas von Hoffman said of Nixon when he left office, that we can just pick him up by the tail and toss him into the dustbin of history. It's not history yet for Trump, but it's no longer center stage. It's no longer the spotlight.
Brooke, one of the things that has really stood out for me over this last, I guess 5 weeks is just how silent Donald Trump has become with his suspension from Twitter. That even as president, he had access to all sorts of ways to get his message out other than Twitter. And it seems like simply suspending his account from Twitter has almost entirely silenced him. I mean, tonight, of course, we see this statement about Mitch McConnell, but it stands out more in the context of, oh, we haven't heard anything from this guy in a while, than it does, sort of the latest in a never-ending barrage of Trump statements. Is this sort of something that you think the platforms, the Twitter specifically, should have done earlier?
Well, I think they should have certainly been tagging his lies as such, particularly his lies about the election. The question that you raise is one that really is transfixing a lot of people in Washington right now. Why isn't he talking? I mean, he made his statement about Mitch McConnell through his PAC, I believe, right? And Maggie Haberman, who of course is one of the people who've been covering Trump most closely for the New York Times, suggests that maybe it's all these lawsuits that his lawyers have told him to just stay quiet until things shake out and he sees where he is. I don't see why that would prevent him from libeling people now, although I guess he can be tried for these things. I don't know if he knows how to speak in a way that stays on the right side of the law when he's so used to having so much freedom. But it is a puzzle. I mean, he has other ways he can talk through other people, just not so fast, so directly. He needs other people to post those things if they aren't going through his account. I also suspect that he will be back on those platforms sooner rather than later.
So we're going to change gears a little bit with this next question from Eric about local journalism. Eric asks, excuse me, not Eric, Glenn, if you're out there. What are the options for revitalizing local media where the news is about what impacts us more directly and through which we can more directly participate?
Well, there's been a lot of thinking going into this. There's right now a kind of AmeriCorps for journalists that's been created that is sharing their salary with the outlets in various states and localities. A lot of people are using journalism students to cover things that really need experience, like the State House. But it's better than no one there at all. People are not getting complete answers in vast numbers of the country, or at least there are certain big cities that have no dailies at all anymore. Certainly not paper ones, but even ones online. And it is absolutely vital. Jeff Bezos could bail out the Washington Post, which really was in trouble before he bought it. And it's become a very important and wonderful paper again. But, and there was a time when newspapers were a patronage operation. Rich families, big publishers would be the ones who kept them afloat. Some of them very public spirited, some of them less so, or some of them intermittently, like, Pulitzer, or, any number of them. So there are a lot of old models out there. Things will change more as more and more people go online. I mean, a lot of people will get their news from really, really good blogs, like Talking Points Memo has updates all the time. And of course, there are a lot of legacy news organizations that are now acting like blogs. Also, another really good fallout from the Trump administration, getting back to something Garrett said much earlier, is that people have gotten over their reluctance to pay for information. When I was a kid, you didn't have to pay for TV at all. You certainly didn't have to pay for water. Now I'm used to paying for those things. And I think people now understand that supporting news organizations can be an act of engagement, can almost be a political act, an expressive act, not just a purchase. If that feeling can be extended to the local level, as it should, maybe that would make a difference.
Yeah, I comment this as someone who covers the FBI a lot, and one of the things that the FBI is seeing, it's the agency that is tasked with investigating public corruption, corruption among local officials, state officials, federal officials. And they talk very explicitly about how, as news deserts expand in the United States, they see public corruption rise. That if there isn't anyone, showing up at the city council meeting, the water and sewer board meeting, the school board meeting, people feel like they can get away with things that
in plain sight.
And that, in fact, you actually saw today a very clear example of this with the South Carolina Post and Courier launching a project aimed at covering public corruption explicitly in areas of news deserts. That they very explicitly framed this new project as trying to expose what they see as a rising tide of corruption in South Carolina as news organizations wither and dry up in that state.
It reminds me of, there are many courageous scientists and public health officials in Flint, Michigan, that were complaining about the water. They couldn't get any traction until 2 news organizations got interested. One was the local public radio station, and the other, very interestingly, was a reporter, the first reporter hired by this non-news organization as a reporter from the ACLU. It was those two together and separately that brought that story to the public. I mean, how can that be? And what does that portend for those of us who are used to thinking that someone is looking into this, you know, but no one may be looking into this, whatever this may be.
Well, and kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, you know, we're also seeing disinformation pop up in local news outlets or in these sort of on websites that are created to appear as sort of benign local news. And so this gets to one more question. I think this will be our last question that we'll have this evening, from Steve, a question about disinformation. He says, some very smart people, among them notably Heather Cox Richardson, believe that a resurrection of the fairness doctrine would save us from the power of cult disinformation. Thoughts?
Do you have thoughts on that, Garrett?
I do. I don't think the fairness doctrine is particularly helpful for what ails us right now. And in fact, there's every reason to believe that reinstituting the fairness doctrine would only be weaponized against
democracy.
Against democracy and issues like climate change, where we have seen bad faith actors attempt to create a debate around issues where there, objectively is not a scientific debate. And I think one of the areas that we might see that play out in a hugely detrimental way right now is around vaccine information, and that we have lived through, I think, 3 different cycles of seeing the damage that disinformation can do. In 2016, we saw the damage that disinformation can do to our politics. In 2020, we saw the damage that disinformation can do to public health. And in 2021, we've already seen the damage that disinformation can do to our democracy, which I, have as distinct from the damage that it can do in politics. Democracy and politics being 2 very separate spheres in my mind. And so I think that given the way that we have seen the media environment unfold over the last 25 years, there is no reason to believe that the fairness doctrine would be a help. And in fact, plenty of reason to worry that it could be actually a major detriment to areas of critical public debate.
I agree. I just remember that before the Reagan got rid of the fairness doctrine, there was one particular medium that was dead. It was completely dead. It used to play music, but better media came along, better formats. And then the fairness doctrine was repealed and, or I should say eliminated, and Rush Limbaugh reinvented AM radio, which then reinvented or created a model for an angry electronic fireplace, which was Fox News. And so it may have been the repeal that created an appetite or a tolerance for the kind of blatant lying that happened in towards the end of the last century and through this one. There used to be a sense of shame that served as a kind of break, but that's no longer there.
We do have one more late breaking question that just came in. Our producer, Anna, got me some rewrite. Are you guys up for one more question? All right. So Jim asks, if you have to pay for truthful media, then wouldn't the wealthy have more access to the truth? And isn't that dangerous?
It depends if you care about the truth. Most people care about what serves them. Even the best intentioned of us are more responsive to what reinforces our point of view. If you asked people through the years, what do you care most about in journalism? The polls will say, accuracy and fairness. But if you look at when the media are most popular, it's when they are expressing the sentiments of the public, whether right during 9/11, the outrage, even though some of the reporting during 9/11 was understandably confused and inaccurate. Or probably a better example is Katrina, where some of the reporting downright stunk, but you had cable news hosts crying and screaming at public officials, and that felt so good. And so the media, again, had a big spike in popularity. When the media really tumbled was during the reporting on Watergate. So what we think we want and what we really want are two very different things.
And public media is free to listen to.
Give what you can.
Brooke, you cited so much fascinating history tonight, and I realized at the beginning I didn't give you a chance to hold up a copy of your new edition. I think you do.
Oh, well, you had a picture of it. This is a sort of my, it's the history of the written word from the beginning till 2042. And it's amazing how the world changed, even the future changed over and over again during the last 10 years. So with Josh Neufeld, the illustrator, I tweaked the text and we tweaked the pictures, and I wrote that afterward. But I worked really hard to make sure that Trump didn't hijack the narrative. So it's still of use, but in fact, the history has stayed the same. It's the present and the future that keep flying into the ozone.
Well, that's the influencing machine. And thank you, Brooke and Garrett, so much for sharing your conversation with us and your expertise and insights and grappling with these big questions. It's been really interesting.
It was a pleasure. And Garrett, it was really fun talking to you.
Absolutely. I'll look forward to listening to you this weekend.
I'm off this week. Bye.
Thank you, everyone who's with us on YouTube. And thanks again to Three Penny Tap Room and St. Michael's College for their sponsorship of this event. And if you have a burning question tonight that we didn't get answered for you, please contact us at listenercomments@vpr.org, and we'll try to get back to you. So thank you again. Have a great night, everyone.